Many Americans just are not truly aware of, that they were experiencing post-traumatic stress, almost like the survivors of war.
Cast is your second offering. You write very brilliantly about race, but not, I hate saying about race because it's not about necessarily race. You're writing about caste, hence the title. Before we get into the discussion about the book and how you put it together and all those other good things, can you explain for the audience what exactly is caste?
Well, caste is a different way of looking at our country. It's an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society. And that graded ranking or hierarchy is what determines a person's standing, levels of respect, benefit of the doubt accorded to a person or a group, or withdrawn from a person or a group, access to resources or lack thereof, assumptions of intelligence, competence, beauty even, through no fault or action of one's own, because in a hierarchy such as ours, you are born to what has been a group that was assigned a particular value going back for centuries and generations. And so you're not having to do anything, you're born into it. And so it's basically a graded ranking of humanity in a hierarchy that creates a hierarchy that then determines so much of one's life, not everything, but so much of one's life when you just come into the world.
Now, you, with Warmth of Other Suns, your first book, I think it took, was it 15 years to write? Okay. All right. That was quite a journey. I know you did more than 1,200 interviews for that, because I believe you either said or I read somewhere where you said you stopped counting at 1,200, correct?
Well, no, that was actually an audition for people to be the protagonist in the book. Essentially, it was like a casting call. And that was why I'm talking to as many people as I did for that book.
So a lot of painstaking care was put into Warmth of Other Suns, and then now 10 years later you have Caste. So describe what the process was like in putting together Caste, say, and the differences versus how you put together Warmth of Other Suns.
Well, it's interesting that you ask it in that way, because one leads to the other. I mean, you know, without Warmth of the Suns, there wouldn't be this new book, Caste. It was through the Warmth of the Suns that I came to become aware of the idea of caste and began using the word. In the Warmth of the Suns, the word racism is not used. That's not to say that it doesn't exist and it doesn't need to be constantly interrogated, considered, and still fought. It's just that it was not the comprehensive, all-encompassing word that was necessary to describe what people had to endure during the Jim Crow caste system, the Jim Crow system, as it was known then. And so I found that you know, as I was discovering things to try to tell the story of 6 million people fleeing or defecting Jim Crow, I had to really go deep in understanding what their lives was like to recreate it for the reader.
Well, that's it is hard to. I see them almost as twin books in many respects, and I think that's pretty much how you described it. But when you were doing Warmth of Other Suns, or before you did that one, like, what was the thought bubble that made you want to look at our society, the prism of race, through the Great Migration? How did that idea blossom?
Yeah, well, you know, if you are African American, raised outside of the South, you are very likely, assuming that if your people did not come from, say, the Caribbean or from the continent, then you are very likely a product of the Great Migration. I'm a product of the Great Migration. Most people that I, you know, grew up around in Washington, D.C. was where I grew up. You know, and then as I've traveled around the country as a correspondent for the New York Times, I would run into people. If I was in Chicago, if I was in LA, Detroit, wherever I was, it was everywhere. I mean, this is literally how African Americans became a people spread out throughout the country. It's how African Americans actually became urban. You know, we just take for granted that, you know, you think of cities and you think of African Americans, but that wasn't the way it was for the vast majority of time that we've been in this country. I mean, for the vast majority of time, from 1619 until the Great Migration, African Americans were primarily a rural people. It was Southern people. 90% of all African Americans were living in the South before the Great Migration began. So it's fairly new, in terms of long history. But because it's so much a part of just how things are now for people alive today, or even just only not that many decades ago, we just take for granted that that's how it's always been. But that if you talk to somebody long enough who's living in Detroit, African American, in Detroit for a couple of generations, you talk to them long enough and you're going to get back to Alabama, you're going to get back to Mississippi, you're going to get back to Arkansas. I mean, that's the way that it is. I mean, that's how everyone was spread out. That's the internal diaspora that happened in our country's history not that long ago. And so as I was becoming more aware of that, as a journalist interviewing lots of people in Chicago in particular, and then recognizing that it was a different stream where I grew up, I just was stunned that there wasn't more written about it. I just, it was this, it's this sea change. It's this, the magnitude of what that means to have almost an entire people relocated to the rest of the country, and thus truly becoming American in the sense of geographically, is so massive. And yet there was very little that was really written about it, particularly from the perspective of the people who had lived it. So I just, I felt that was the one thing that I wanted to do. It was like the only thing, it was like this big open puzzle that was right there in front of everyone's eyes, and we weren't really talking about it. And so that's why I started to do. And the more I looked and the more people I talked to, the more fascinating it was for me, and the more massive. There was just a watershed in not just African American history, but in our country's history.
So when the book was published, what were your notions about how it might be received?
I did not know. I mean, I just wanted to get it done. It was 15 years. I often say that if it was a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long it took me to finish that book. So, so I just was so happy to have it done. And, the main response that I would get wherever I would go was people would say, no matter what their background, no matter what their age was, they would say, I had no idea. It was stunning to me that people who lived through that era would say, I had no idea. Because generally speaking, people who had endured it and survived Jim Crow weren't talking about it. In fact, that's one of the challenges in even doing a book of that kind, talking to people who had lived through it, and people, many people that I would talk to since then at these events I might do, people would come up to me and say, I try to get my mother to talk about it. I try to get my grandmother to talk about it. They won't talk about it. They just don't. They just keep. They just do not want to talk about it. They don't want to go there. And it's really
why do you think that is?
And it's universal. I mean, I hear it all the time. And I believe, after having talked to so many people and interviewed so many people who went through this, is that it's just too painful. It's like post-traumatic stress. People, there have been studies that have been done, or other works that have said that if you were African American in the South, into the 1960s, most people knew of someone who had been lynched. I mean, someone in the town, sometimes even a relative, going out and talking about the War for the Sons, as I did after it came out, and even up until just the time of the COVID hit. People would tell me all kinds of stories about how their family left, and it was an uncle who had to go because he was about to be lynched, or they knew someone in their family was lynched. So it was such a a repressive world that many Americans just are not truly aware of, that they were experiencing post-traumatic stress, almost like the survivors of war and upheaval, other kinds of upheaval. And I think that they just did not want to relive that. I also think that they wanted to shield their children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren from what they had endured. And then, to me, even more tragically, is I think a lot of people who survive such things, they absorb the trauma to such a degree that they begin to blame themselves. They begin to carry a kind of shame, as if there is some type of stigma attached to what they had endured. And because there's very little in the way of affirmation in the rest of society for having gone through that. And so a lot of them, I think, experience a lot of shame that to me, that's the most tragic of all, because they were born into a system, not of their own making. They had nothing to do with the creation of it. The main thing was to try to survive, and their survival alone, I think, is a reason for honoring them and respecting them and holding them with a sense of awe, really, that they could survive all that they did. So those are the reasons why I think that it just didn't get talked about.